The Bird Hunter, an Indonesian folktale. Raja Ishak, the king of Batak, just loved archery. While his friends talked about other things, he would talk about bows and arrows from sunrise till sunset. He never seemed tired of talking about and playing with such things. Soon, everyone came to know of the king's love of archery. Now the king had a very beautiful daughter called Bintang Devi. She was so beautiful that it was the wish of every young man to marry her. But Raja Ishak let it be known that only the best archer in the country could have his daughter as wife. One day, the king decided to hold an archery contest to choose the best archer in the country. Many people from far and near came to take part. However, none was successful as the king didn't think that any of them was good enough to marry his daughter. Now, in Batak, there lived a poor bird hunter by the name of Vajan. He heard that Raja Ishak had a beautiful daughter and she would marry anyone who was good at archery. Vajan thought that it would be wonderful if he could marry the princess. He had a clever plan. He caught some wild birds with a net. He then killed the birds and took out of the right eye of each. He put a string through the eye of the birds and tied them together. Then he made his way to the palace. On the way, he shouted, "One-eyed birds for sale! One-eyed birds for sale!" Soon a group of children began to follow him, as they had never seen a man selling one-eyed birds before. As he went, Vajan shouted, "One-eyed birds for sale! One-eyed birds for sale!" Finally, he arrived at the gate of the palace. The king, seeing a crowd of children at his gate, sent a servant to see what the matter was. The servant returned and said, "Your Majesty, there is nothing the matter, only a poor bird hunter trying to sell birds, each with only one eye." On hearing this, the king stood up. He thought for a moment. "Send the man in at once." Raja Ishak said. So Vajan was brought before the king. "Is it true that the birds you're selling are all with one eye only?" Raja Ishak asked. "Yes, your majesty. I shot all my birds with the bow and arrow. I always shoot them in the eye," replied the poor hunter. Raja Ishak was very surprised at what he had just heard. He could hardly believe his ears. "Young man, it is not an easy matter shooting the birds in the eye with an arrow. You must be the greatest archer in the country," the king said. "A great archer like you should have a beautiful wife. What do you say if you marry my daughter?" added the king. The bird catcher quickly replied, "But your majesty, I'm only a poor bird hunter. Where can I get the money to give your daughter the kind of life she is used to?" "Ah, not only are you a great archer, I see you are also an honest person. As a king, I can give you all the money you need. And as for the house, why, you can move into the palace," said the king. Vajan was very happy when he heard this, but he didn't show it. Not long after the wedding took place, Vajan put on the new clothes he was given. He felt very pleased with himself. At last, his wish had come true. Now, he had everything, a beautiful princess for a wife and a house in the palace. At the wedding, there was a big feast. Raja Ishak invited many of his friends to come. It was a beautiful day. Birds of every color were flying in the sky. The food was good and the musicians never played better music. Everyone was enjoying himself. Suddenly, overcome with joy, the king jumped up and said, "Listen, now the great archer himself will show us his skill with the bow and arrow." On hearing this, Vajan nearly fainted. When he got over the shock, he said, "Your Majesty, much as I like to show you all my skill, I'm sorry I can't, as I left my bow and arrow at home when I came." Vajan thought that he had given a clever answer. But the king was not to be put off. He said, "That doesn't matter at all. You may use mine." Then he sent a servant to fetch his bow and arrow. Vajan all this while was shaking from head to toe, as he knew his end was soon coming. Just then the servant returned with the king's bow and arrow. Vajan all this while was shaking from head to toe, as he knew his end was soon coming. Just then the servant returned with the king's bow and arrow, and these Raja Ishak thrust into the hunter's hands. "There you are," said the king. "Now show us your skill." Now Vajan had never used the bow and arrow before. Slowly he drew the string and pointed the arrow skywards. He stood there afraid to let go the arrow. At that time, birds were flying all over, and people began to wonder why the great archer didn't even shoot one down. Some began to laugh at him openly. One said, "Look, he's afraid. He can't even hold the bow and arrow properly." At last, one man, who couldn't stand the joke anymore, walked up to the hunter and slapped him hard on the back, saying, "Shoot now, great archer." The hard slap on his back made Vajan let go the arrow. Just then a crane was flying by, and the arrow hit in the neck. The bird fell to the ground dead. Raja Ishak picked up the bird, and when he saw the arrow in the crane's narrow neck, he shouted, "You are indeed the greatest archer I've never seen." All the people were taken by surprise. But Vajan seemed very angry. He said loudly, "I'll never touch the bow and arrow ever again. As I have said before, I always shoot my birds in the eye and not in the neck. If not for someone who hit me on the back, I would surely shoot the crane in the eye." The king then spoke angrily to the man who hit the hunter on the back. As for Vajan, he never had to touch the bow and arrow again, and no one could say that he wasn't the greatest archer in the country. The end.